skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. By the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
As Bill mentioned, my name is Blair Griesheim, and I'm a docent or a tour guide at the National Museum of World War II Aviation located just across the ramp. I'm going to repeat a little bit about what Bill said. The QR code up on the screen. If you have a phone, scan that with your camera, and you can subscribe to that YouTube channel. This is a free educational tool that the museum offers, and it provides a lot of information on different battles and aircraft. I highly recommend it. And if you could help us, the museum, spread the word about that YouTube channel, we would greatly appreciate it. Also, this presentation will probably be added to it, and if you want to go back and check it out, that's great. But if you can let others know about it too, so they can keep watching these presentations, that would be helpful. Anywho, today what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss one of the best kept secrets of World War II, the Women Airforce Service Pilots. I'm going to discuss who they were, why they were flying military aircraft, how they formed, some of their duties, and then I'll wrap it up with militarization. I want to first start with who these amazing, heroic, and adventurous female pilots were. First of all, they came from all walks of life and different economic levels. We had actresses and models, debutantes. There were professional athletes. Iris Cummings, she was an Olympic swimmer. Helen Detweiler, she was a professional golf player. There were doctors, students, moms with kids, Reno blackjack dealers. There were strippers that were there. There was also a nurse on a horse from Kentucky. So I could go on and on about what all their backgrounds were, but what all of these women had in common was that adventurous spirit, that desire to want to help with the war effort, and above all, a deep, deep desire to want to fly. Now, although the majority of WASP were white, they were not exclusively so. There were two Chinese-American WASP, Hazel Ying Lee and Maggie G. There were also two known Hispanic descendants, Vernda Rodriguez and Frances Diaz. There was one known Native American, Ola Mildred Rexroot. She was part of the Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota. Now, the total number of black female pilots, it's kind of unknown how many applied to the program, because get this, this is crazy. They destroyed the WASP application records. So we really don't know how many black females applied to the program, but we do know that they applied. Janet Bragg, she applied to the program, and she made it all the way through the screening process to the interview stage with Jackie Cochran, where Jackie told her in the interview that it was difficult enough fighting prejudice aimed at females without additionally battling race discrimination, and she was rejected. Now, with this said, this doesn't mean that there were no black sailors, soldiers, or aviators. Of course there was. We all remember the Tuskegee Airmen, right? It just means that they were segregated or kept in a separate unit. As far as black females, that created kind of a unique dynamic. They were both black and female. This created a challenge for them, which created less opportunity for them. Now, the military was segregated during World War II. Okay, it wouldn't become desegregated until 1948, when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981. Okay, now the WASP were organized as U.S. Federal Civil Service employees, so they basically had one foot in the civilian world and the other foot in the military world. So how did that happen, right? That's kind of odd. Well, they were civil service employees who were promised that they would become militarized. Therefore, in anticipation of that, they were going to be trained as if they were military personnel. Now, during their 2 years of service, 25,000 American women applied. 1,820 were accepted to the program. 1,074 graduated, and in those 2 years, they flew 77 different types of military aircraft. Basically, every aircraft in America's air arsenal at that time, from Piper Cubs all the way up to the 4-engine heavy bomber, the B-29 Super Fortress. So, I guess I forgot a part here. That's why I have cheat sheet here. They flew over 60 million miles in those 2 years. So that's a little flavor of who they were, but why, in a time when women seldom worked outside the home, were they even flying military aircraft? Well, the WASP operated between 1942 and 1944 during World War II. And as we know, war is a team effort. And since women weren't allowed in combat overseas yet, they could still fill vital roles stateside. One, to help out with the war effort on the home front, and two, to free up a male pilot who could fly combat missions overseas. So that's a little bit of why they were flying. So now we have the who and the why. Let's dive into the how. How were they formed? Well, the WASP were preceded by 2 earlier, relatively independent programs for women flyers. We have the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. I'll call them the WAFS. That's its acronym sounded out. Now, I want to be careful here. When I say the acronym WAFS, it sounds a lot like WASP. So right now, I'm not talking about the WASP. I'm talking about the WAFS. I hope I'm not confusing you. I'm talking about the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. Now, the second group was the Women's Flying Training Detachment. When you sound out that acronym, it's the WFTs. So the first 2 programs, WAFs and WFTs. The first group formed was the WAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. And 28-year-old, keep in mind, 28-year-old. I don't know what you were doing when you were 28, but I definitely wasn't doing this. 28-year-old Nancy Harkness Love was named director of that group. Okay? Now I'm going to confuse you some more here. So they were formed on September 5th, 1942, but an official announcement wasn't put out until 5 days later on September 10th, 1942. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you about this date. This is an important date to remember for later when I talk about the second group, the WFTs. So keep this date in the back of your mind. This is the date that they announced the formation of the WAFs. Now, Love's plan was implemented first because it was simple and it was prepared in a more military manner. Therefore, it could be implemented faster. Love envisioned a small number of highly qualified female pilots who would only require just a few weeks of training to get familiar with military rules, courtesy, customs, and more importantly, military paperwork. Now, the qualifications to apply for both male and female ferry pilot applicants varied. The reason behind this difference in requirements is that the women's program was sold as an experiment. They wanted to see if the women could handle the challenges of flying. Now, I'm absolutely sure that there was a wee bit of sexism going on there too, but they said it was an experiment, so there were some differences in it. So the female applicant, she had to have a high school diploma. The male applicant only needed 3 years of secondary school. So, guys, the women were smarter than the men. So just saying there. So the women had to be between the ages of 21 and 35. The male applicant between 19 and 45. A 200 horsepower rating was required by both male and female, and a commercial pilot's license. The difference was in the hours. The female applicant needed 500 hours of flight experience before she could apply, whereas the male applicant to ferry pilot training needed only 200 hours. Okay? Now, both sexes had to be American citizens, and both male and female needed to have cross-country experience. So that was the requirements. Now, the original assignment for the female ferry pilot was to ferry small, single-engined aircraft like the Piper Cubs, which we don't have one on display. The other one was the Fairchild PT-19. That's the aircraft sitting back there. And the Stearmans. That's those two over there. And that's why we chose the Stearmans to fly today, because they are one of the original aircraft that the WAFS, eventually WASPs, would fly. 28 women, averaging approximately about 1,200 hours of flight experience each, answered their country's wartime call and joined the WAFS. These 28 women were known as the originals, the first women to fly for the United States. Now, they began operations with the 2nd Ferrying Group in Newcastle Army Air Base in Wilmington, Delaware, and this would also serve as their headquarters. The reason for stationing the WASP there was that it was located close to the manufacturers of primary trainers. So the Fairchild PT-19s, they were manufactured in Hagerstown, Maryland. The Piper Cubs, they were manufactured in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania. Now, I told them I might get off on a tangent, and if I got off on a tangent, they were going to yell squirrel, so I would get back on track, and again, the reason for the cheat sheets. But I am going to get off on a tangent here with the Piper Cubs. They were manufactured in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania. And the WAFs thought the Piper Cubs were kind of like a 4-cylinder go-karts. They weren't very fast. And so because they were manufactured in Lock Haven, they decided to start calling the Piper Cubs the Lock Haven Spitfires. I cannot get that out of my head, so anytime I see a Cub, that's what I call it. So hopefully now you guys too will start calling them the Lock Haven Spitfires.
Lock Haven Spitfires.
Exactly. So anywho, Love, she was a well-educated and highly respected leader. It was said that she was calm, discreet, practical, and reserved. She did not want to fly a desk. She wanted to fly airplanes. So her job was an operational one. She was a hands-on manager, and she led by example. Love often ferried aircraft herself. With this said, Love was the first woman to fly a P-51 Mustang. Love was the first woman to fly a P-38 Lightning. Love, along with WASP Betty Giles, were the first women to fly a B-17 Flying Fortress. Love got along with the men in the ferrying division, and she worked with them to prove the concept that men and women should be under the same command. Her argument, the airplane does not know the gender of the pilot flying it. So she set out to prove just that. Now, while Love was forming the WAFS, world-renowned racing pilot and cosmetic entrepreneur Jackie Cochran, she was over in England. She had taken 25 of some of America's best female pilots overseas to fly with the British Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA. Now, she had no role in training these female pilots. She never flew herself with the ATA. She simply organized and took 25 women overseas to England to fly with the ATA. Now, these American female flyers, they had to fulfill an 18-month service contract, as did Cochran. But Cochran added a stipulation to her contract that allowed her to dissolve it if she so wanted. And she only served 6 months out of those 18 months. So when do you suppose she came home? This isn't a trick question. Remember that date? Earlier, I told you guys to remember. Does anybody remember that date? Tell me that date. 1942. Exactly. Yay, someone's listening, right? September 10th, 1942. So, she leaves England, she gets on a plane, she flies back, long flight, transatlantic flight. She lands, she gets off the plane. The first thing she does is she picks up a newspaper. Bam, she's hit with the news. Oh boy, was she furious. She thought that job should have been hers. So she made a beeline for the office of the top commander of the United States Army Air Force, right? Isn't that what you would do? No. That's General Henry Hap Arnold. And she persuaded him to approve the training of more female pilots and to put her in charge of that group. So 10 days after the formation of the WAFS, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, on September 15th, 1942, the War Department announced a second women's military pilot training program. They were called the Women's Flying Training Detachment, or the WWIIs. Now, the WWIIs, as a training organization, had a lower standard of admission than the WAFs. This is because they were not as experienced as the WAFs, and they had to be trained up to meet Army standards. So their qualifications were: have a high school diploma, be an American citizen, have a personal interview with an authorized recruiting officer, and this was usually Jackie Cochran herself. They also had to have a 64 Army medical exam. Now these physicals, they were identical to the ones given to the male cadets. Now I want to clarify here, there is some differences between male and female physical structures. So obviously, during these exams, there were some slight differences between them. But the 64 exam was designed for prospective combat pilots, and they would often require the entire day with a flight surgeon. They also had to have a minimum height requirement. Initially, this was at 60 inches, but they bumped it up to 62.5 inches in April of 1943, and then they bumped it up to 64 inches, and I don't know if this is 64 inches, I might be way off here, but this was in the summer of 1944. The reason for changing the height requirement was because the women were transitioning into pursuits, bombers, and transports, and they needed to be long enough to reach the foot controls. So that's why they were changing the height requirement. There was also a 200-hour flying requirement that they needed before they could enter the military pilot training program. This means that the women flyers had to be proven flyers. They already had to have flight time. Now, eventually, this was knocked down to 100 hours, then to 75 hours, then to 35 hours, where it would remain until the end of the program. Now, like I said, this was described as an experiment. And so the reason for the change in the hours is they wanted the more experienced female flyers at the beginning to help get the program established and off to a smooth start. And they realized that they would have to eventually bump that down. Now, male cadets entering military pilot training, they needed no flight time whatsoever to enter, but the females needed 200. Now I want to talk about something that really gave me a tickle. This is crazy. I hope it gives you a tickle too. The initial age limit was set between 21 and 35 years of age. But eventually they reduced that minimum age, 21, down to 18 and a half years of age. That was in 1943. This is because they wanted to capture more people. As they were taking people out of the pool thins, right? You have less people to pick from, and they wanted to expand that. To expand that, they had to lower that age. But the part that gives me the tickle is the upper age. The United States Army Air Force put a cap on female cadets at 35. This is a quote, okay? Quote, to avoid the irrationality of women when they enter and go through menopause. End of quote. So, see, they thought that menopause would begin at the age of 40, and if they allowed women to enter at 35, surely the war wouldn't last more than 5 years, right? So by 5 years, they would just be entering that time of deliberating irrationality. So they wanted to avoid that. So that minimum age never changed, or that maximum age never changed. It always stayed at 35. Now, training for the women paralleled but did not duplicate that of male cadets. The female pilots were expected to ferry aircraft, not go into combat. So their training emphasized cross-country flying, not gunnery or formation flight training. And their training had 3 components. It was military, ground, and flight. In the military section, they learned military courtesy, customs, regs. They learned military drills. They marched everywhere. And again, that military paperwork. The ground school component was the bookwork portion of their studies. This is where they learned about the principles of flight, aircraft engines, propellers, navigation, weather, stuff like that. The flight training portion is where they actually got to fly the aircraft. This was broken down into 3 phases: primary, basic, and advanced. Now, the women trainees during training would be paid $150 a month. Afterwards, their pay would be bumped up to a whopping $250 a month. Okay? The male pilots, after a duty assignment, got paid $380 a month. I used a U.S. inflation calculator to see what these dollar amounts meant in today's money. You can see it up on the screen. That is a huge difference in pay between the two sexes performing the same duties. Now, the WASP could eat in the enlisted men's mess hall, but they had to pay 50 cents a meal. The men got to eat for free. When they ferried aircraft to other training bases and they had layovers, the WASP could choose to stay at the barracks at that air base, but they would have to pay $1.50 a night. The men stayed for free. Those uniforms, initially the WASP, whether they were WAFs, WFDs, or WASP, I know that's all very confusing, but initially they had to pay for all that up front. Those famous Santiago blue uniforms, they were not issued until February 11th, 1944, almost a year and a half into their 2-year service. Now, those were paid for by the government. So the first training location for the WFDs was at the Houston Municipal Airport in Texas, but this proved to be inadequate, and so they established a second school at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. The few weeks of its existence as an all-female air base, hundreds of curious male pilots made forced landings at Avenger Field. Now, they were just, we all know what they were doing. They were just wanting to kind of oogle those female trainees. And this led to Avenger Field being closed to all outside air traffic, and thus Avenger Field was dubbed Cochran's Convent. So, got to keep those women safe, right? So, anywho, Cochran was the complete opposite of Love. Her plan was more complicated than Love's. She envisioned a separate, all-female Air Force with her as its top commander. And for her to achieve this goal, she took on an administrative role. She didn't ferry aircraft. She didn't attend instruction courses or officer training school like Love did. It was said that she was a wee bit arrogant, direct, aggressive, and explosive. She had a lot of political clout with the Roosevelts. She liked to throw that weight around to make sure she got what she wanted. She was also known to make exaggerated statements and be very flamboyant with her wealth. Now, because of this, she unfortunately alienated the people and the organizations that should have been her closest allies. But she repeatedly lobbied General Henry Hap Arnold for complete control over all of the female pilots. And the quibble here, I know that when you start reading a lot about them, the quibble here was not between Cochran and Love, as the media like to report. That's a sexist assumption about, two women having a cat fight. I mean, that definitely sells papers, but that was never substantiated by fact, and it ignored all the other documented reasons for the tug of war. The true squabble was between Cochran and the Air Transport Command leaders. They were in a tug of war over those valuable resources of pilots. Who controlled them? Who set their requirements? Who gave them orders? Who disciplined them? That kind of thing. And Cochran eventually wore General Arnold down, and she won that wrestling match. So on July 5th, 1943, she was named as director of all female pilots. And Love was named as executive over the female pilots in the Air Transport Command's ferrying division. A month later, on August 5th, 1943, 334 days after the first formation of the women's group, the WAFS, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, the WAFS and the WFDs would be merged into a single unit for all female pilots, and they would be called the Women Airforce Service Pilots, with their pilots being called WASP. So there you have it, a very long-winded how they got together. Now, a fun fact here, I just wanted to add this because I think it's fun, is the WASP mascot, Fifinella. She was an object of unit pride with them. Fifinella was developed by Walt Disney Studios to be part of an animated film that was later dropped and it was never made. But that film's story came from a children's book. It was titled The Gremlins, and it was a fairy tale about the hazards of combat flying. Why would that be a children's book? I don't know. But hey, let's go with it. So in this fairy tale about the hazards of combat flying, male pilots blamed many of their mishaps and problems on these prank-playing gremlins. Now, the WASP decided to take a little bit of a different approach to their female gremlin. Instead of her being a troublemaker, she was a kind-hearted gremlin who helped the WASP out of tight spots. Anywho, I think she's kind of cute, and I just wanted to show her. So now let's talk a wee bit about their duties. What did the WASPs do? Well, they were first trained as military pilots to ferry aircraft from manufacturers to training bases, or they would fly them to modification centers where the aircraft would be modified to meet climate and combat conditions of its final destination, or they would fly them right out to Newark, New Jersey on the East Coast, where they would be put directly onto Liberty ships to be shipped directly overseas to combat theaters. Now, they also served as test pilots. They tested engines and instruments that were fresh off the manufacturing line to make sure they worked properly. If they discovered a problem, they wanted it fixed before it reached the hands of a combat pilot overseas. They also test flew aircraft that had crashed and been repaired, just to make sure it worked right. Sounds a wee bit dangerous there, right? Another thing they did is they flew damaged war-weary aircraft to boneyards. These were Class 26 missions. This was an extremely dangerous mission because these aircraft, they weren't always airworthy. One of the more interesting missions that they did is they flew aircraft while they towed a 20-foot cloth target behind their aircraft to help train anti-aircraft gunner recruits improve their shooting accuracy. To do this, for the smaller guns, they would fly in dive bombers, like the SBD Dauntless, the museum has one, and the SB-2C Helldiver. It's being restored right back there. Okay? For the bigger guns, they would fly in bombers, like the B-24s and the B-26s. Now, this blew my mind. This is crazy stuff right here. They were using live rounds when they were shooting at the WASP. So any mishap there could damage the aircraft and cause an accident or shoot a pilot. So basically, the WASP were clay pigeons in a shooting gallery out there just saying, please just hit my target. So they also stimulated a strafing, radar jamming, searchlight tracking missions, strafing. They towed the Waco CG-4 gliders. And to do that, they piloted a C-46 and a C-47. Another mission they performed is they were flight instructors. They trained the male pilots to fly aircraft. They did this in aircraft and in link trainers. We have a fully functional link trainer over at the museum. If you guys want to know more about a link trainer, head over to the museum. They give an excellent presentation on it. Another mission that they performed, and I found these really exciting, is they test flew radio-controlled drones. These drones were called PQ-8s and PQ-14s. This was a highly classified WASP project, and it was the genesis for the aerial unmanned vehicles that we fly today, the UAVs we fly today. And that was a crazy, crazy project. Now, many of the male pilots, they refused these missions. They considered these dangerous and unappreciated flight missions as dishwashing jobs. Jobs that were routine and dull, dangerous with no glory attached to them. They wanted to die in the glory of battle, not in the glory of training. So they thought these tedious, everyday, humdrum missions should be performed by the female pilots, not the male pilots. Now, I'm telling you this because I will come back to these dishwashing jobs when I talk about militarization. So put a pin in that and save that for later. Now, innovations in aviation were lightning fast during World War II, and in 3 years of the most concentrated research and production effort that the world had ever seen, aviation and technology had become almost unrecognizable by the end of the war. And these new technologies and aircraft, they were really scary looking. And it was here that the WASP made some of their most startling contributions to the war effort. They were put into the cockpit of the military's newest and most sophisticated aircraft simply to goad male pilots into approaching their training with more enthusiasm and to help boost their confidence. And this was first done in the misjudged B-26 twin-engine bomber. This aircraft was a challenge to fly and accident-prone if not flown correctly. Fearful pilots, they began calling it the Widowmaker, the B-crash, the Flying Coffin. Instead of the B-26 Marauder, it was the B-26 Murderer. Okay? So you can imagine that their morale was pretty low. So in the fall of 1943, an entire Army base in Alabama was called unexpectedly to the flight line and made to watch a spectacular air show by two B-26 bombers. After the air show ended, they taxied up to the formation line, and out climbs 4 WASP, 4 women. So, grumbling by the male pilots, well, it quickly ended after that. They thought, okay, I'm not gonna say anything anymore. Then we have WASP Dora Dortree and WASP Dorothea Mormon. They were given flight training in the costliest and most complicated aircraft made at that time, the B-29 Super Fortress. Now this aircraft was really big and really scary looking. Initially, one of its major problems was engine fires. Even before the plane had taken off, while it was on the ground, it would catch fire. So male pilots were like, nope, we're not flying that. It's a pilot killer or widow maker. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, yes, that Paul Tibbets, he oversaw the training for the B-29 pilots. He had heard about the B-26 morale boost that the WASP did, so he hired his own WASP Dora Dortree and Dorothea Mormon. And once the men saw that the women could successfully fly that B-29, well, they stopped complaining too. Got to leave it to those women, right? So then we have another WASP. She saved countless lives by developing innovative landing techniques and the Bell P-39 Air Cobra. Now this aircraft was kind of unique in that the engine was mounted behind the pilot rather than in front like most pursuits. Therefore, the weight of the aircraft is different. It's further in the back, right? Now, many of the male pilots, they didn't read the tech orders for the aircraft, so they would let that light nose raise too high where it would spin in and crash. In 1 month, there were 30 accidents in a P-39. All of them were male pilots, and 15 out of those died. So those are some crazy stats. So in June of 1943, WASP Del Shar, a careful, systematic, detail-oriented pilot, climbed into the cockpit, and she became the first woman to fly an Air Cobra. And for days, she practiced takeoff and landings, and she was experimenting with different speeds to see how the aircraft would react. And she realized that the men needed to land the aircraft at a higher speed than they were using. After that, takeoff and landing accidents in Air Cobras virtually stopped. Then we have WASP Ann Baumgardner. She's a really exciting WASP. She was assigned to the Fighter Flight Test Unit, that's the FFT unit, at Wright Field, Ohio. Now, Wright Field was a big deal during World War II. A lot was going on there. It was basically like the equivalent to the Houston Space Center today. While there, she was asked to perform tests in a B-29 Super Fortress. She was asked to perform tests specific to see if the aircraft could handle a 9-ton bomb load packaged in a 10-foot by 2-foot area. Does that sound familiar to anybody, right? A woman was doing this, right? So what that package is, so in August 6, 1945, Lieutenant Paul Tibbets, he would fly that B-29, the Enola Gay, carrying a payload that was nearly identical to the payload Baumgardner was testing. And that payload was called Little Boy, and it was heading to Hiroshima. But more amazingly, Baumgardner, in October of 1944, she became the first American woman to fly an American jet, the YP-59 Air Comet. So that's pretty cool. Now, by January 1944, ferrying pursuits would become the ferrying division's #1 job. The 4-engine B-17s and B-24s, they were needed to pound away at Germany, and those swift pursuits were crucial to protecting those bombers as they flew their bombing runs into enemy territory. So get this. By 1944, by the fall of 1944, half of all the ferrying or air transport command's fighter pilots were women. Half of them. The women were flying 3/4 of all domestic deliveries of those pursuit aircraft. By the June 8th, 1944, WASP had taken over all of the male ferry positions at the Republic Aircraft Factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, and ferrying P-47s from Farmingdale to their next location was an all-female operation under the leadership of WASP Betty Giles. It's crazy stuff right there. I think I missed a slide. I get to talking and I forget to push things. Anywho, by 1943 and all through 1944, WASP were also ferrying P-51 Mustangs. They would get them out in California, Inglewood, California. They would fly them all the way across the United States to Newark, New Jersey. This was about a 10-hour flight. Barbara Town, up there on the screen, she flew P-51s while pregnant. Yeah, she was allowed to continue to fly until she could no longer get the stick back because of her baby bump. So yeah, crazy stuff. Now the War Department put out a report in 1944 that found that the women's fatal accident rate was slightly lower than that of their fellow male pilots. During the WASP program, there were 402 accidents. During that time period with that many accidents, 35 of those were fatal. 9% were fatal. When they looked at the men's fatal accident rate, it was 11%. So the women's fatal accident rate was slightly lower. And the women's non-fatal accident rate was also slightly lower. That might be because they had 1 year more of high school. Just saying. But anywho, with this said, 38 WASP gave their life for their country. Okay? Now I'm going to wrap this up. I see some of you, your butts are probably getting sore and stuff. I'm going to wrap this up with militarization. All through the existence of the WASP program, the Army Air Force was trying to get them to become militarized. It all came to a climax in February of 1944 with House Bill H.R. 4219. This bill touched off a political firestorm when General Arnold testified in front of the House Military Committee. He said the WASP were good flyers. He planned on keeping them. And he wanted to see the program grow, and he wanted to send all of the male pilots overseas to combat. Now, at this point in the war, the air campaign overseas had been successful. The German Luftwaffe had been crushed. Americans and our allied forces now kind of ruled the sky. We really didn't need more pilots. We were in need of foot soldiers to launch a massive ground assault. So the Army Air Force, it cut back its training on those male pilots, and it revoked the civilian flight instructors' draft deferments. This meant that stateside male pilots and instructors could now be drafted into the walking army. Not wanting to become part of the infantry, some of these stateside pilots began eyeing those dishwashing jobs. Remember when I told you about those? Yeah. All of a sudden, those were looking like pretty sweet jobs to them, so they could stay stateside. And they started a smear campaign against the WASP in which to squeeze the women out to let the men in. the smear campaign was successful and the bill was defeated, the WASP would remain civilians. The WASP were the only female unit during World War II that were disbanded before the war ended, and the only female unit that did not become militarized or receive military benefits. The WACs, the WAVES, the SPARs, and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, they all became militarized and they all received military benefits. The WASP received none. When a WASP died in the line of duty, she received no military burial benefits. Her fellow WASP would literally pass a hat amongst themselves to collect enough money to send her body and her belongings back home to her family. December 20th, 1944 was the WASP deactivation day. When the WASP were deactivated, it deprived the Air Transport Command of hundreds of expert ferrying pilots. That cost millions of dollars to train male pilots to catch up with all of their experience. And because that training took time, it hampered the delivery of aircraft for 6 months, caused a serious backlog in aircraft. Now, that's talking about ferrying aircraft. This doesn't take into account all of the other missions the WASP were performing and how it hampered them. The WASP story was basically missing from the U.S. history books because the government sealed, classified, and stored their records for 35 years. Their records were not declassified until the 1980s and later. So efforts to grant full veteran status to the WASP, it kind of languished in Congress until 1977. So what happened in 1977 that changed everything? Well, the Air Force announced that for the very first time, it would begin to accept women for pilot training. Well, that wasn't true, right? The WASP were the first. This upset them. They rose up to demand the recognition that they deserved. So on November 23rd, 1977, 33 years after their service, President Carter signed a bill into law that provided the WASP veteran status. Then in 2009, President Obama signed a bill into law granting the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal. Now, WASP were a small, but they were a significant cog in the jigsaw puzzle of victory. Their efforts provided essential logistical support in outfitting the troops on the front line to ensure that they were successful in combat. I mean, material, just because you want it, it doesn't appear out of thin air, right? The supply chain and the support groups are essential in winning any war. So what makes a WASP a hero is not only her flying records and her achievements. It's that grit and that determination that she had to not give up. They continued to fight for benefits that were rightfully theirs. They continued to fight for the recognition they deserved, and they fought for the acknowledgement, to be publicly acknowledged, and that's what makes them heroes. So I got a hold of some people who keep track of all the WASP, and they told me that there are only 6 WASP living today. They range between the ages of 100 and 102. They reside in Georgia, California, Utah, and Hawaii. So, anywho, that's my dog. I love my dog. The WASP aren't a secret to you guys anymore. And I would really appreciate it if you would let people know about our YouTube channel so they can watch this presentation when it gets added, so they can learn about the WASP too. Better yet, just let people know about the museum, because if they come over to the museum, they can see our storyboards and our displays. We have very knowledgeable docents and staff members who would love to talk to them. I really appreciate your time and your attention. Thank you for getting up early and putting up with me. Anywho, that's it, and that's all.